Now, though, we've got Annabel Denham, Deputy Comment Editor from The Telegraph. We've been talking this morning, Annabel, very good morning, very good afternoon to you, I should say, about a whole bunch of stuff, including a change in the welfare sickness benefits scenario, a change for the government to say to people who feel anxious that perhaps they might be able to find something that they can do. The Telegraph, your paper, saying whatever they do, it's going to be delayed till 2025. We'll get to that. Let's kick things off, though, with schools, shall we? Because the school day, school year, really, for everybody started pretty much this week, one day or another. Most of the schools I've seen in London started today. We've got a problem, though, with 147 schools in total under the sort of cloud of the concrete crisis. 19 have had their start of term delayed. We've also got Chris Whitty, rather strangely and ironically, calling for parents to send their kids to school, even if they're sick.
Yes, that's right. And what an intervention, really, from the chief medical officer, given his role and involvement during the coronavirus pandemic. Yeah. The decisions that led to much of the country being locked down, and particularly the closure of schools for, in my view, far too long, and with terrible alacrity, really, from our politicians. But no, this is Chris Whitty saying that children with mild and moderate anxiety are likely to be better off attending school because long periods of absence could make their symptoms worse. Now, I think there's a very widespread concern now that post-pandemic school attendance is far too low. More than a fifth of pupils in England were persistently absent from school in 2022 to 2023, up from 10.9% in 2018-19 before the pandemic. And there are all sorts of reasons for this. There's understandable fears that there is a cohort of ghost children that may never fully return to school. And of course, so many pupils have had long stretches of very disrupted learning. They've been isolated from their friends. They've had Zoom, online learning. And as if that wasn't bad enough, during COVID, of course, we had a spate of teacher strikes. And it's almost no wonder that parents are wondering whether their children need to go into school, because the attitude from the government and some of the teaching unions appears to be that it isn't really that important. Well, of course it is. And, children made a terrible sacrifice during the pandemic, and there doesn't seem to be any appetite for making it up to them.
No, quite. And the Department for Education have actually issued a statement today which says that, notwithstanding what Chris Whitty's advice is, it's very clear that some parents think they shouldn't send their kids to school if they've got something, like a sniffly cold or a runny nose, because that's the way they've been kind of trained. That's the way they've been nudged, if you want, or possibly even just, persuaded to believe that, we mustn't let disease spread in school. I mean, the whole point about school is that disease spreads. I was saying to somebody earlier today on the show, when my kids were young, as yours I think are now, you were constantly running with a cold. You constantly had some kind of runny nose because they came back from school with all sorts of hideous, dreadful, ghastly germs, and you just sort of always hoped that it wasn't going to be norovirus.
No, exactly. I think that's just part of life for pupils and for parents of school-aged children, especially after the summer break. The children are going back into a classroom, into a confined environment where they're going to be spreading various germs that were contracted over the summer. And what we can't have are parents becoming complete hygiene obsessive germaphobes. But unfortunately, like you say, Mike, they've almost been trained into that. There's a concern now, if your child is ill, perhaps they have got COVID. And sure, free testing ended months and months ago, but I think there's still that hangover. What if it is the coronavirus? Do we really want to be sending them into the school where they could spread it? And compounding this, of course, is not just fears for your children's health, but also now fears for their safety with this rack chaos. Thousands of pupils who are not attending school, many pupils who are going to be educated in porta cabins or be sent to neighbouring schools. This is a massive issue, even if at the moment it's only affecting a small number of, our 22,500 schools up and down the country.
Yeah, exactly right. Because, you know, what I'd like to see from either the schools or from the Department of Education is a statement about the situation regarding COVID, because more and more people in just anecdotally around me are saying they've tested positive for COVID. It's obviously doing the rounds again, as it has done, and as for no reason anyone should be alarmed about. But I would like a statement absolutely full and frank and absolutely certain that the schools will not shut again if, for example, more people start getting COVID. Because it didn't make any difference really last time to the spread of it. And I don't think anybody in their right mind would say, oh, because we shut the schools, nobody got COVID. Absolute rubbish. So, you know, I'd like to see them actually coming out with a statement that says if there is another, you know, incidents that we consider to be what you might call an outbreak of COVID, we won't suddenly go into panic mode and shut everything.
No, and I think to be fair to the government, they showed commendable strength in the face of serious opposition by remaining open when the Omicron variant came onto our shores and started spreading in December 2021. And it's exactly that attitude that needs to be retained. School closures in particular should be an absolute last resort measure that the government should be looking at. And, you know, lockdowns themselves, you know, really ought to be a last resort as well, not the first lever that politicians will now pull because it's been normalised, because actually the government, the public proved itself to be extremely compliant during the pandemic. It was extraordinary, really, that people did not protest against these massive infringements on their civil liberties. And the concern, of course, is that that will endure if, you know, if the government does decide to try and shut us in our homes, keep out of the classroom again in the future. People will reflect on 2020, 2021 and think, well, we did it then, we can do it again now, if it's regarded to be in the national interest. And there is still a very vocal but small minority who are zero COVID fanatics, who are still very worried about the spread of this particular virus and who will lobby the government to take extreme measures. And we have to revert to a position like the one we had in 2019 and before, where life, I'm afraid, is full of risks and bad things will often happen to good people. But we have to be free to make trade-offs. We have to be free to take on personal responsibility and have our own autonomy to be presented with information and make our own judgments accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely right. Because at the end of the day, that decision that was taken in 2021 was taken pretty much single-handedly by Boris Johnson, who just said, I'm not having it. Because I'm pretty sure at the time that Chris Whitty and others were telling him that he should do another lockdown. And in the same way that you say there are still voices that will make those noises, yes, they are. And they're all coming from the same place. It's all independent Sage and all these people at Imperial College and all the usual suspects who think that, you know, if you put a mask on, suddenly everything's different. Well, it isn't, is it?
No, of course not. I mean, masks, there's various studies about their efficacy. There's an argument to be made that the fact that people were wearing masks made other people feel reassured and therefore they wouldn't adhere to the 2-meter and keep their distance from others. There, you know, others studies that suggested they indicated that the pandemic was still with us and therefore led to people being more cautious. But I think the jury is still very much out on the efficacy of face coverings. Of course, you know, WHO did not help by adding to the confusion, initially saying that it was useless and then saying that they supported the use of face masks and that they would help slow the spread. Governments adopting them accordingly. So, you know, I think we're a very long way, Mike, or at least I hope we are, from reverting to the kinds of draconian measures that we saw in 2020, 2021 to deal with COVID. But I think, you know, two serious issues that we're facing now is this general attitude that lockdown is an acceptable thing for a government to bring in the event of some kind of spread of a disease or so, you know, so on and so forth. And also, you know, this ongoing effect that it has had on children's learning. And, you know, I don't know what the government is doing to catch up, help pupils catch up. I haven't heard anything, I don't know if you have, Mike, since Kevin Collins resigned as the catch-up czar back in 2021. He did so because he felt that the government wasn't willing to pay enough money to help pupils make up for all of that lost learning. It just all seems to have been forgotten, and we have to stop letting young people down in this way.
No, we've had the knock-on effect, haven't we, of people going to university last year with a set of results which were literally made up out of thin air, many of whom are now struggling because they're not really qualified. They haven't done the work at A-level that they should have done in order to do the course that they're now doing at university. So there's a massive dropout rate, apparently, for one thing. And then secondly, on the lower end of the scheme, people who took their A-levels and took GCSEs this year found that they were marked down because last year's results were so ludicrously inflated. You know, and in fact, my own son's projections for his GCSE results were quite low, and he did an awful lot better. And he said to me, well, if this had been last year, I would have got really, really, you know, very ordinary results, when in fact his actual results were a lot better. So the whole system was broken.
It is. And there's, of course, the third problem, which is that the devolved nations haven't tried to correct the grade inflation in the way that England has. So what we saw were pupils in England getting lower marks than those in Northern Ireland or Scotland or Wales. And, you know, whichever way you look at it, the whole thing seems terribly unfair. You know, perhaps they ought to have just continued with normal A-level and GCSE assessments during the pandemic if there had been a way for the government to roll that out and to ensure that it was maintained. I think ultimately they were right to bring back down A-level grades. We cannot have a situation where they are just continually inflated until you getting an A star is actually meaningless and they have to bring in a star or a triple star. You know, how far do you go with this? Like you say, it has led to some students arriving at university with inflated grades that indicated that perhaps they were more knowledgeable, more competent, brighter than in fact they are, and they've been really struggling at university, and they've had to, you know, some of them have had to drop out. So it's not really fair whichever way you look at it. One thing I would add is that, you know, in 2010 the Conservative government was actually really committed to stopping grade inflation at schools, and it did bring down the number of pupils who were getting A's at A-level quite considerably. But clearly, you know, more work needs to be done. And, you know, I just, you know, spare a thought for, you know, those pupils who did their A-levels perhaps during the pandemic, then went straight into university in 2020, who, you know, have had the most grim university experience. When you come into university as a fresher, it's all about socializing, it's about making new friends, it's about being independent from your parents, perhaps for the very first time. And a lot of students were forced to stay home, or if they were in halls, they were shuttered in there, and they didn't have, you know, proper lectures, tutorials, so on and so forth. There was a lot of online learning. Then the government tried to suggest that they couldn't go home for Christmas, if you remember. And the idea that they would just sit at, you know, perhaps alone in their halls in order that they wouldn't bring the virus back from university to their hometowns. And it's, you know, never really recovered from that point. And that same cohort are coming into the workplace at a time where, you know, real wages have been stagnant for years. They, you know, they may not even have a proper degree certificate. They may not have been graded at university because of the marking boycott. And there must be such a profound sense of hopelessness among those people. It's awful.
Yeah, absolutely right. Stay with us, Annabel, if you would. We've got plenty to talk about still. Birmingham Council and the fact that they might now want to put up their council tax bills because of their impending bankruptcy, and also $1 million on sickness benefits, having to find a job. What are we going to have them do? This is TalkTV.